The darkness of space held secrets that most people preferred to forget. In the year 2387, somewhere in the cold emptiness of the Kepler system, a massive ship drifted like a ghost from another time. The Un's vengeance had been floating there. For over 200 years, its black hull scarred by battles that no living person remembered. The ship was enormous, built for war in an age when humanity fought for its very survival. Its weapons were silent now, its engines cold, and its corridors empty of life. But deep in the heart of the vessel, in a chamber surrounded by layers of armor and shielding, something waited in the darkness. Admiral Jake Morrison lay in a cryogenic pod, his body preserved in artificial sleep. The machines that kept him alive hummed quietly, powered by a fusion reactor that could run for 1,000 years. Morrison had been humanity's greatest military commander during the Terran Zenith Wars, a conflict so brutal that people had tried to erase it from history. They called him the Reaper because, wherever he went, death followed in his wake. When the wars ended, Morrison had made a choice that shocked everyone who knew him. Instead of retiring to a life of honor and comfort, he had volunteered for indefinite suspension. He believed that his methods, his knowledge of total warfare were too dangerous for a world that wanted peace. So he had sealed himself away, along with his ship and its terrible weapons, hoping that humanity would never need him again, light years away. Lieutenant Amy Carter sat at her station aboard the research vessel HMS Discovery. She was young only 24 years old, with bright eyes and a curious mind that had earned her a place on one of humanity's most advanced exploration ships. Carter specialized in communications and signal analysis, skills that had made her valuable to the scientific community. The Discovery was investigating gravitational anomalies in the Kepler system, routine work that involved scanning empty space for unusual readings. Carter found the work peaceful after growing up hearing stories about humanity's violent past. Modern humans were diplomats and scientists, not warriors. They solved problems with words and technology, not weapons and bloodshed. Carter was running a deep space scan when her equipment picked up something unusual. At first, she thought it was just background radiation, but as she adjusted her instruments, she realized it was something else entirely. There was a massive object out there, hidden in the shadow of a dead moon, and it was made of metal. She called her commanding officer, Captain Ron Blake, to the communications station. Blake was a veteran explorer with 30 years of experience in deep space, but even he had never seen readings like these. The object was huge, easily the size of a military battleship, but there were no active ships registered in this system. Carter refined her scans and discovered something that made her heart race. The object was not just any ship, it was broadcasting a faint signal on an emergency frequency that had not been used for over 2 centuries. The signal was so weak that only the Discovery's advanced sensors could detect it, but it was definitely there. Blake ordered the Discovery to change course and investigate. As they approached the mysterious object, its true nature became clear. It was indeed a battleship, but unlike any vessel in the current human fleet. This ship belonged to another era, when humanity built machines for destruction rather than exploration. The Unvengeance was a monster of war, its hull bristling with weapon mounts and armor plating. Carter studied the ship's design and felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen pictures of such vessels in history books, but seeing one in person was different. This ship had been built to kill, and it looked like it had done its job well. As the Discovery moved closer, Carter's instruments detected the source of the ancient signal. It was not coming from the Vengeance itself, but from somewhere else in the system. The emergency beacon was using the old Terran emergency protocol, a frequency that had been abandoned when humanity joined the Galactic Council. Carter traced the signal to its source and discovered something that made her blood run cold. The transmission was coming from a human colony on the edge of the system, a settlement called New Haven that housed 50,000 people. The signal was a distress call, weak and desperate, broadcasting on the only frequency their outdated equipment could reach. The message was simple but terrifying. New Haven was under attack by an alien force that called itself the Vex Coalition. The colony's defenses were failing, and they were begging for help from anyone who could hear them. They had been broadcasting for weeks, but no one had answered. Because modern ships no longer monitored the old emergency frequencies, Carter brought the situation to Captain Blake, who immediately contacted the human authorities. But the response was not what she expected. The Galactic Council wanted to handle the situation through diplomatic channels, which could take months. The human government, led by President Lisa Harper, was reluctant to take military action that might damage their reputation as peacekeepers. While the politicians debated, Carter found herself drawn to the silent battleship. She convinced Blake to let her board the Vengeance with a small team to investigate its systems. What she found inside amazed and terrified her in equal measure. The ship was a tomb filled with the ghosts of humanity's violent past. The corridors were lined with weapon lockers and tactical displays, while the bridge contained command systems designed for coordinating massive battles. But it was the ship's central chamber that truly shocked her. Admiral Morrison lay in his cryogenic pod like a sleeping dragon, surrounded by monitors that tracked his vital signs. Carter accessed the ship's records and learned about the man who had volunteered to sleep away eternity. Morrison had been humanity's most feared commander, a tactical genius who had never lost a battle. He had ended the Terran Zenith Wars through methods so brutal that even his own people had been horrified. As Carter studied Morrison's records, she realized that the ancient emergency signal had triggered something in the ship's systems. The Vengeance was slowly coming to life, its computers responding to the distress call from New Haven. Deep in the ship's core, Morrison's revival sequence had begun. Carter watched in fascination and horror as the machines began to wake humanity's last war god. She knew that once Morrison opened his eyes, nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy had forgotten what humans were capable of when they chose war over peace. But Admiral Jake Morrison remembered, and soon he would remind them all why humanity had once been the most feared species in known space. The SOS signal from New Haven continued to broadcast, growing weaker with each passing hour as the colony's power systems failed. Time was running out for 50,000 innocent people, and their only hope lay in the hands of a man who had been sleeping for 2 centuries. A man who understood that sometimes peace could only be preserved through overwhelming violence. The revival process was slow and painful. Admiral Jake Morrison felt consciousness creeping back into his mind like water filling an empty well. His body ached in ways he had forgotten were possible, and his mouth tasted like metal and medicine. The cryogenic chamber around him hissed as warm air replaced the frozen gases that had kept him alive for over 2 centuries. Morrison opened his eyes to see a face he did not recognize. A woman with dark hair and kind eyes was watching him with a mixture of fear and fascination. She wore a uniform that looked nothing like the military clothing he remembered, and her expression held none of the hardness that all soldiers develop during wartime. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Helen Brooks, a xenobiologist who had been studying the preserved archives aboard the Vengeance. She spoke in a soft voice that reminded Morrison of how people talked during peacetime, when they did not have to worry about enemy forces listening to their conversations. Brooks explained that she was part of the team from the Discovery that had found his ship. Morrison tried to sit up, but found his muscles weak from centuries of disuse. Brooks helped him into a sitting position and offered him water from a container that looked far too clean and delicate to belong on a military vessel. As he drank, she began to tell him about the world he had awakened to, and with each word, Morrison felt more like a relic from a forgotten age. Humanity had changed in ways that Morrison found difficult to understand. The wars that had defined his life were now considered ancient history, studied by scholars but not discussed in polite company. Humans were members of something called the Galactic Council, an organization that promoted peace and cooperation between different species. The idea of multiple alien races working together seemed impossible to Morrison, who remembered when humanity fought alone against enemies that wanted to wipe them from existence. Brooks told him about the current human government, led by President Lisa Harper, a diplomat who had built her career on peaceful negotiations and humanitarian aid. The human military was now commanded by General Carl Peterson, whose forces focused on disaster relief and peacekeeping missions rather than warfare. The concept of professional soldiers who had never seen real combat was foreign to Morrison, who had grown up when everyone fought or everyone died. As Morrison listened to Brooks describe this new world, he felt a growing sense of disconnection. The humanity she described sounded soft and vulnerable, protected by treaties and good intentions rather than superior firepower. He wondered how long such a peaceful existence could last in a universe that he knew was full of predators. Brooks showed him recordings of modern human society, and Morrison watched in amazement as people went about their daily lives without fear of sudden attack. Children played in open spaces without guards, and civilians traveled between planets without armed escorts. It was the kind of life that Morrison had fought to create, but seeing it made him realize how much he no longer belonged in such a world. The conversation was interrupted when Lieutenant Amy Carter entered the revival chamber with urgent news. The SOS signal from New Haven was growing weaker, and long-range sensors showed that the attacking force was preparing for a final assault on the colony. Carter explained that she had been monitoring the emergency frequency and estimated that New Haven had perhaps hours left before their defenses completely failed. Morrison asked about the human response to the crisis, and Carter's answer filled him with cold anger. The Galactic Council was demanding a diplomatic solution that could take weeks to organize. President Harper was concerned that any military action might damage humanity's reputation as a peaceful species. General Peterson was willing to send peacekeeping forces, but only after receiving proper authorization through official channels. While politicians and bureaucrats debated procedures, 50,000 innocent people were about to die. Morrison had seen this kind of paralysis before. During the early days of the Terran Zenith Wars, when human leaders tried to negotiate with enemies who understood only strength, the result had been millions of casualties and the near extinction of the human race. Carter showed Morrison the intelligence they had gathered about the attacking force. The Vex Coalition was a militaristic alliance of species that viewed diplomacy as weakness and conquered through superior firepower. Their leader, Warchief Thrak, commanded a fleet of heavy cruisers and assault ships that had overwhelmed New Haven's outdated defenses with ease. Morrison studied the tactical data and felt his old instincts awakening. The Vex had positioned their ships in a standard siege formation, confident that no rescue force would arrive in time to challenge them. They were fighting an enemy they believed to be weak and cowardly, using tactics designed to maximize fear rather than efficiency. It was exactly the kind of arrogance that Morrison had exploited countless times during the wars. Brooks and Carter watched as Morrison's expression changed from confusion to cold calculation. The gentle man who had awakened from his long sleep was disappearing, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded fleets and decided the fate of worlds. Morrison requested access to the Vengeance's command systems and was shocked to discover that most of the crew positions were automated. The ship's artificial intelligence could handle navigation, engineering, and weapons control with minimal human supervision. During his time, such technology had been theoretical, but apparently centuries of peace had allowed for remarkable advances. In automated warfare, he also learned that the Vengeance represented technology that modern humans barely understood. The weapons and defensive systems aboard his ship were considered impossible by current galactic standards, relics from an age when humanity fought for survival against overwhelming odds. The quantum phase torpedoes, reality displacement shields, and tactical computers were beyond anything the Vex Coalition had ever encountered. Morrison made a decision that he knew would change everything. He would take the Vengeance to New Haven and answer the distress call, with or without official permission. Brooks and Carter tried to explain the political consequences of such an action, but Morrison had spent his life making hard choices that other people could not stomach. He asked for volunteers to crew his ship, knowing that anyone who joined him would be defying the current human government and possibly starting a war with the Galactic Council. To his surprise, several people stepped forward, including Carter herself and a veteran officer named Commander. Nick Sullivan, who had grown up hearing stories about the old wars, the Vengeance prepared to leave its centuries-long resting place. Morrison felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. He was about to remind the galaxy why humanity had once been feared throughout known space, and he knew that some lessons were written in blood and fire, the SOS from New Haven continued to broadcast, and Morrison intended to answer it in the only language that Predators truly understood. The Vengeance came alive like a sleeping giant opening its eyes. Morrison walked through corridors that had been dark for centuries, watching as automated systems activated one by one. The ship's artificial intelligence, which called itself Athena, greeted him with a voice that sounded almost human but carried undertones of vast computational power. Morrison's small crew moved through the massive vessel with a mixture of awe and terror. Lieutenant Carter found herself assigned to the communications station, surrounded by equipment that could intercept and decode signals across half the galaxy. Commander Nick Sullivan took his position at Tactical, studying weapon systems that made modern military hardware look like children's toys. Dr. Brooks remained aboard to help operate the ship's advanced medical and scientific systems. She had volunteered partly out of curiosity and partly because she understood that Morrison would need someone who could think beyond pure military tactics. The fourth member of their crew was Chief Engineer Tony Martinez, a veteran who had served on the older ships and understood some of the Vengeance's outdated but powerful technology. As they prepared for departure, Morrison began explaining to his crew what they were really facing. The Vex Coalition was not just another group of raiders or pirates. They were a militaristic society that believed strength was the only virtue worth respecting. They had studied modern humanity extensively and concluded that humans were weak creatures who preferred talking to fighting. Morrison accessed the ship's tactical database and showed his crew examples of Vex warfare. The aliens fought with overwhelming force and little regard for civilian casualties. They conquered planets by destroying infrastructure and killing anyone who resisted, then enslaved the survivors. Their technology was brutal but effective. Designed to inspire fear rather than achieve elegant solutions, what worried Morrison most was how unprepared the galaxy seemed to be for this kind of enemy. The Galactic Council operated on the assumption that all conflicts could be resolved through negotiation and compromise. They had built a civilization based on the idea that intelligent beings would always choose peace over war when given the option. The Vex had no interest in such choices. They saw diplomacy as weakness and mercy as foolishness. They conquered because they could, and they would continue conquering until someone stopped them with superior force. Morrison had fought enemies like this before, and he knew that the only language they understood was violence applied with overwhelming precision. As the Vengeance moved through hyperspace toward New Haven, Morrison began training his crew in the realities of total warfare. He explained concepts that modern humans found difficult to accept, starting with the basic principle that in real war, there were no rules except victory and survival. Carter struggled with some of Morrison's lessons, particularly his explanation of psychological warfare. Morrison showed her how the Vex used terror as a weapon, destroying targets that had no military value simply to break the enemy's will to fight. He explained that sometimes the only way to stop such tactics was to demonstrate that you were more frightening than your opponent. Sullivan adapted more quickly to Morrison's teachings, perhaps because he had grown up hearing stories about the old wars from his grandfather. He understood that the clean, honorable combat described in modern military manuals was a luxury that only existed when both sides agreed to follow the same rules. Against an enemy like the Vex, such restraint would only lead to defeat and death. Morrison also explained the true capabilities of their ship. The Vengeance had been built during humanity's darkest hour, when survival required innovations that pushed beyond moral boundaries. The quantum phase torpedoes could pass through shields and armor as if they did not exist. The reality displacement fields made the ship nearly impossible to target accurately. The tactical computers could process millions of combat scenarios per second and identify weaknesses that human minds might miss, but the ship's most dangerous weapon was Morrison himself. He had spent decades studying the art of war, learning how to break enemy formations, shatter their morale, and turn their own strength against them. He understood that victory in combat was not just about superior technology, but about superior thinking and the willingness to do whatever was necessary. Meanwhile, the situation at New Haven continued to deteriorate. War Chief Thrak had positioned his fleet in a perfect siege formation, systematically destroying the colony's defensive installations while avoiding damage to the infrastructure he planned to claim. The Vex leader was confident that no significant rescue force would arrive in time to challenge his victory. Thrak had studied human behavior extensively and believed he understood their weaknesses. Modern humans were soft creatures who relied on technology and diplomacy rather than personal courage. They fought defensive wars when forced to fight at all, preferring to minimize casualties rather than achieve decisive victories. The few human military forces that Thrak had encountered were easily defeated by superior Vex firepower and tactics. On New Haven itself, Mayor Pete Harrison tried to maintain order among the colonists while Captain Lisa Martinez organized what remained of their defenses. The colony's shields were failing under constant bombardment, and their communication systems could barely maintain the weak SOS signal that had already been broadcasting for weeks. Martinez knew that her small militia could not hold out much longer against the Vex assault forces. Her weapons were designed for law enforcement and defense against pirates, not military-grade combat against a professional invasion fleet. She had lost half her people in the first day of fighting, and the survivors were running low on ammunition and medical supplies. The colonists themselves were mostly scientists, farmers, and technicians who had come to New Haven seeking a peaceful life on the frontier. They had no experience with warfare and could barely comprehend the brutality of their attackers. Some prayed for rescue while others prepared for the inevitable end, but none of them imagined that help was coming from the distant past. As the Vengeance approached the edge of the New Haven system, Morrison made his final preparations for battle. He studied the tactical situation and began developing a plan that would not just defeat the Vex fleet, but send a message that would be remembered across the galaxy. The aliens had awakened something that should have remained buried, and Morrison intended to remind them why humanity had once been the most feared species in known space. The time for peace and diplomacy was over. Admiral Jake Morrison, the Reaper of the Terran Zenith Wars, was about to show the galaxy what total war really meant. The Vengeance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the New Haven system like a predator emerging from tall grass. Morrison stood on the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the tactical display with cold precision. The enemy fleet spread before him like pieces on a chessboard, each ship positioned exactly where he had expected them to be. War Chief Thrak commanded 12 heavy cruisers and 40 smaller vessels, arranged in a standard siege formation around the struggling colony. The Vex ships were sleek and deadly, built for intimidation as much as combat. Their hulls gleamed with weapon arrays and shield generators, displaying the technological superiority that had made them confident in their easy victory. Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. The Vex had positioned themselves perfectly for the kind of battle they expected to fight, a straightforward engagement where superior numbers and firepower would overwhelm any defending force. They had not prepared for an opponent who understood that warfare was about more than matching weapons against weapons. Commander Sullivan reported the enemy positions while Lieutenant Carter confirmed that New Haven's shields were down to 15% power. The colony's desperate SOS signal continued to broadcast, growing weaker as their communication systems failed under constant bombardment. Mayor Harrison's voice could be heard pleading for anyone to help his people, unaware that salvation was already moving toward them through the darkness of space. Morrison ordered Athena to begin a full tactical analysis of the enemy fleet. The ship's artificial intelligence processed thousands of data points in seconds, identifying weapon types, shield frequencies, engine signatures, and command protocols. Within minutes, Morrison had a complete picture of his opponent's capabilities and weaknesses. The Vex ships were powerful but designed for conventional warfare. against enemies who followed predictable tactics. Their shields were calibrated to stop energy weapons and kinetic projectiles, while their armor was built to withstand direct assault. What they were not prepared for was technology that operated outside the normal rules of physics. Morrison gave his orders in a calm voice that carried absolute authority. The Vengeance would not announce its presence or demand surrender. There would be no warning shots or attempts at negotiation. The battle would begin with overwhelming violence designed to shatter the enemy's confidence and tactical coherence. The first quantum phase torpedoes launched in complete silence, their exotic matter warheads passing through normal space like ghosts. The Vex sensors detected nothing because there was nothing conventional to detect. The torpedoes phased through the enemy shields as if they were empty air, materializing inside the hulls of 3 heavy cruisers simultaneously. The explosions that followed were beyond anything the Vex had ever witnessed. The quantum warheads did not simply destroy matter, they unraveled the fundamental forces that held it together. The 3 cruisers vanished in flashes of impossible light, leaving behind expanding clouds of exotic particles that disrupted sensors. Throughout the enemy fleet, War Chief Thrax's command bridge erupted in chaos as his officers tried to understand what had just happened. Their instruments showed impossible readings, energy signatures that violated every known law of physics. 3 of his most powerful ships had simply ceased to exist without any apparent cause. Morrison watched the enemy's confusion with professional satisfaction. Fear was a weapon more powerful than any torpedo, and he intended to use it with surgical precision. He ordered the Vengeance to decloak, revealing itself to the terrified Vex fleet in all its ancient glory. The sight of the human battleship sent waves of panic through the enemy formation. The Vengeance was larger than any Vex vessel, its hull scarred by battles that had ended before their civilization learned to build starships. Weapon ports that had been dark for centuries began to glow with deadly energy, while shield generators created distortions in space itself. Thrax recognized the design from historical records and felt his blood run cold. This was one of the legendary human war machines from the ancient conflicts, vessels that had broken entire star systems during humanity's violent past. He had studied those wars and believed that such ships no longer existed, their terrible knowledge buried along with the civilization that created them. Morrison opened a communication channel to the entire Vex fleet, his voice cutting through their tactical frequencies like a blade. He spoke in perfect Vex, having studied their language during his preparation for battle. His words were simple and direct, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The Admiral told them that they had made a mistake in attacking New Haven. They had expected to face weak humans who would beg for mercy or die quietly. Instead, they had awakened something that should have remained sleeping. Morrison explained that he was going to demonstrate the difference between modern humanity and the species that had once conquered half the galaxy. Through pure violence, the Vex fleet attempted to respond with coordinated fire, dozens of energy beams and plasma torpedoes converging on the Vengeance's position. Morrison's reality displacement shields activated, creating distortions in space-time that made the human ship nearly impossible to target accurately. Most of the enemy fire passed harmlessly through empty space where the ship appeared to be, but was not. The few shots that did connect struck barriers that existed partially outside normal reality. The exotic energy was absorbed and redirected, feeding power back into the Vengeance's weapon systems. Morrison had turned the enemy's attack into fuel for his own retaliation. The human counterattack began with methodical precision. Morrison did not simply destroy enemy ships, he dismantled them in ways designed to maximize psychological impact. Quantum disruptors tore through Vex hulls like tissue paper, while gravitational mines created localized black holes that consumed entire vessels from the inside out. Each destroyed ship became a lesson for the survivors. Morrison demonstrated technologies that the Vex could not understand or counter, weapons that struck without warning and defenses that made retaliation impossible. He was not just winning a battle, he was teaching the enemy that they were children playing with toys while facing a master of destruction. War Chief Thrak watched his fleet disintegrate around him and finally understood the magnitude of his error. The humans he had studied were not the same species that built ships like the Vengeance. Modern humanity had buried their capacity for total warfare so deeply that they had almost forgotten it existed. But Admiral Morrison remembered everything. And he was sharing that knowledge one dead ship at a time. The systematic destruction continued as Morrison hunted down each remaining vessel with the patience of an apex predator. The Vex learned that running was impossible and fighting was futile. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, facing an enemy who fought without mercy or restraint. The Reaper had awakened, and he intended to harvest every ship that had dared to threaten innocent human lives. The last Vex ship floated alone in the wreckage of what had once been a mighty fleet. Admiral Morrison had deliberately spared War Chief Thrak's flagship, leaving it crippled but intact among the expanding clouds of debris and exotic radiation. The Vex commander sat in his damaged bridge, surrounded by the bodies of his crew and the sparking remains of his command systems. Morrison opened a final communication channel to the surviving ship. His voice carried across space with the weight of absolute authority, speaking words that would be remembered long after the battle was forgotten. He told Thrak that he was being allowed to live for a specific purpose, to carry a message back to the Vex Coalition and anyone else who might consider attacking human colonies. The message was simple but terrible in its implications. Humanity had buried its capacity for total warfare but had not destroyed it. The peaceful humans that the galaxy knew were real, but they existed only because others were willing to do the dark work that civilization required. Morrison warned that there were more ships like the Vengeance hidden throughout human space, sleeping guardians that would awaken if their people were threatened. Thrak listened to Morrison's words with the stunned comprehension of someone who had looked into the abyss and seen it looking back. The war chief had built his career on the belief that strength was the only virtue worth respecting, but he had never encountered strength like this. Morrison had not just defeated the Vex fleet, he had erased it from existence with technology that seemed to violate the basic laws of reality. Morrison ended the communication and ordered the damaged Vex ship to leave the system immediately. Thrak's vessel limped away into hyperspace, carrying with it the knowledge that humanity was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The war chief would spend the rest of his life trying to convince his people that attacking humans was suicide, though few would believe his reports until it was too late on New Haven. The colonists emerged from their shelters to see the impossible sight of their attackers. Destruction scattered across the sky. Mayor Pete Harrison stood among his people, watching debris burn up in the atmosphere like falling stars. Captain Lisa Martinez counted her surviving militia members and tried to process what had just happened to save their lives. The colony's communication systems came back online as Morrison established contact with the surface. His voice was different now, gentler than it had been during the battle, but still carrying the authority of someone who commanded life and death. Morrison identified himself and asked about civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. Harrison found himself talking to a legend he had only read about in history books. Morrison's name was known to every human child as the admiral who had ended the Terran Zenith Wars, but most people believed he had died centuries ago. The idea that he had been sleeping in a battleship, waiting to answer distress calls, seemed too incredible to accept. Morrison ordered his crew to begin disaster relief operations, using the Vengeance's advanced medical facilities to treat the wounded colonists. Dr. Brooks transported down to the surface with medical supplies and equipment that was far superior to anything the colony possessed. The same ship that had just erased an entire fleet from existence was now saving lives with equal efficiency, but even as the immediate crisis ended, Morrison knew that larger problems were just beginning. The Galactic Council had detected the battle and was demanding explanations for what they considered a war crime. President Harper was facing pressure from dozens of alien species who were terrified by the display of human military capability. Morrison received priority communications from Earth within hours of the battle's end. General Peterson demanded that he surrender himself for immediate court-martial, while President Harper ordered him to return to Earth for questioning by the Galactic Council. Diplomats across known space were working frantically to contain the political damage caused by Morrison's actions. The Admiral found himself caught between two impossible choices. He could submit to arrest and face trial for saving 50,000 innocent lives, or he could resist and force humanity into a war it was not prepared to fight. Modern humans had built their civilization on the promise that they would never again resort to the brutal methods that Morrison represented. Lieutenant Carter approached Morrison on the bridge of the Vengeance, her young face showing the strain of everything she had witnessed. She had volunteered for this mission expecting adventure and discovery, not the systematic destruction of an entire fleet. Carter asked Morrison if he regretted his actions, if saving New Haven had been worth the consequences that would follow. Morrison considered her question carefully before answering. He told Carter that he had spent his entire career making decisions that other people could not stomach, choices that saved lives by taking them. The colonists of New Haven would live because the Vex fleet had died, and that mathematics was the only one that mattered to him, but Morrison also understood that his methods came with a price that peaceful humanity should not have to pay. The galaxy now remembered what humans were capable of when they abandoned restraint, and that memory would change every relationship humanity had built over the past 2 centuries. Fear and respect were closely related emotions, but they were not the same thing. Morrison made his final decision aboard the bridge of the ship that had been his home for over 2 centuries. He would not force humanity to return to its violent past simply to protect him from the consequences of his actions. The knowledge of total warfare was too dangerous for a peaceful civilization to possess, and the temptation to use such power would eventually corrupt anyone who held it. The Admiral recorded a final message for the human government and the Galactic Council. He explained that his actions had been necessary to save innocent lives, but he accepted that such necessity came with a price. Morrison announced that he would return to cryogenic sleep, taking with him the knowledge that the galaxy was better off forgetting, but Morrison also left behind a warning that would echo through history. The universe was not a safe place for the weak, and sometimes the price of peace was eternal vigilance. He had answered the call from New Haven because 50,000 people needed help, and no one else was willing to provide it. There would always be predators in the darkness, and someone had to be ready to face them. As the Vengeance powered down once more, drifting back into the cold emptiness between stars, Morrison's words became legend among both humans and aliens. The war god slept again, but he would always answer the call. The galaxy could only pray that it would never need to wake him.